Hello and welcome to episode 20 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'll be reading from chapter 6 of the book titled The Internet and Radical Voices of Dissent that I published in 2025. The chapter is titled New Weapons of Resistance, and it's written by Sue Branford. There is a battle of ideas raging in the Brazilian Amazon between the forest people and land thieves. And at the centre of this struggle is the use of digital technology employed by both sides. The forest people have harnessed technology to fight for their land and ancestral rights and to protect nature from land thieves for over 500 years. But the power of modern communications in the forests of the Amazon has taken this struggle to new and sophisticated levels. In the 1980s, Indigenous leader Mario Jaruna, better known as Cacique Jaruna, became the first Indigenous person to be elected to Brazil's federal parliament. A Xavante man from Mato Grosso state, he lived in the forest with little contact with the outside world until he was 17. Once elected, he became famous inside Brazil and abroad for always carrying with him a tape recorder, at the time a relatively bulky device. He said that he needed to, and I quote, record everything the white man says, because he realized that the white man's promise was not to be trusted. His behaviour, taken as picturesque at the time, shows how the Indigenous can incorporate white man's technology and use it to strengthen elements in Indigenous culture. Jaruna incorporated the K7 recorder and used IT to reinforce the importance of keeping one's word, a basic Indigenous value. There was nothing new in Jaruna's use of technology. Thousands of years before the European invasion in the 16th century, the ethnically and linguistically diverse indigenous peoples of the Amazon forest exchanged technological advances among themselves to improve their way of life. Today, the Kayapó indigenous people of the Amazon are one of those who, this century, have been appropriating new technology most effectively in defense of their territory. For the Kayapó, digital technology has become their modern-day weapon of choice in a struggle stretching back centuries against colonizers. A recent example of the Kayapó's skill involves a gang of land grabbers headed by 39-year-old A.J. Vilela, otherwise known as Jotinha. The gang had been operating for years and had illegally cleared 300 square kilometres of forest, an area the size of the city of Canterbury in the United Kingdom, and it was all protected public land, located beside the Kayapó Reserve. Jungle felling on this scale made Vilela the largest individual clearer of land in the Amazon since the monitoring of deforestation began, according to Juan Doblas, who at the time monitored the region's deforestation for the geoprocessing laboratory at the NGO Socio-Environmental Institute, otherwise known as ISA. Selling cleared land was profitable. According to the Federal Public Ministry, Brazil's independent prosecutors, £360 million passed through Vilela's bank accounts between 2012 and 2015. Vilela, both a sophisticated entrepreneur and criminal, hired geomonitoring technology-savvy kids to inform his overseers in the field to precisely locate how many trees they could safely fell without their work being captured by the satellites. In this way, the system did not emit deforestation alerts from the satellites, and without alerts there was no reason to go to the area, explained Luciana Evaristo, head of environmental protection in the government's environmental agency, IBAMA. When the understory clearing was complete, the remaining large trees were then felled. Only then would the damage be detected by the satellites, and by the time IBAMA arrived in the area, the land thieves would have gone. The Vilela gang underestimated the territorial monitoring capacity of the Kayapo. Evaristo told us, "The Kayapo came to Brasilia to report the terrible deforestation that was being carried out on the border of their territory, and they demanded that measures be taken." This indigenous report took the government by surprise. Their geomonitoring system wasn't registering any deforestation where the Kayapo said it was happening. Ibama scrambled to send in investigators, including the Director of Environmental Protection. "They took us directly to 5 camps," said Evaristo. The director was astonished at the indigenous' ability to monitor the forest. They have an efficient intelligence system, and the various villages use radio to tell each other in Kayapo what is going on, he said. In this way, he continued, they always know what is happening in their territory. The operation led to the arrest of Vilela, but he was released after a few months. He received heavy fines, but he appealed, and it appears that none of the fines has ever been paid. The state did not reclaim the land, and Vilela and his crew had illegally occupied. The Kayapo kept the thieves off their land and demonstrated that Brazil's indigenous people are capable of harnessing Western technology, in this case radio, in the defense of their lands. And the public image of Vilela and his family, who until then enjoyed all the privileges of Brazil's exclusive and powerful land-owning elites, was permanently damaged. The Kayapo have a long history of incorporating Western technology. In 1988, Kiabeti, the first Kayapo filmmaker, took part in the filming of the debates in Brazil's Constituent Assembly as it drew up the new constitution. And he said a few years later, "Video is our bow and arrow, our arms." Glenn Shepard, an anthropologist at the Emilio Goldi Museum in Para State, who has studied the Kayapo, said, "The Kayapo have a phenomenal ability to incorporate and appropriate weapons, ornaments, names, songs, and other cultural goods captured from their enemies. The use of a camera as a weapon of cultural and territorial self-defense seems to be a clear extension of this ancient Kayapo translation of capturing and appropriating such war trophies. The camera has literally become a bordana, or a club, in their hands." In recent years, the Kayapo and other indigenous peoples have extended their appropriation of new technology to digital devices. Today they are routinely using mobile phones to record invasions of their land, and when it is too dangerous for them to approach armed intruders, they fly drones over the forest to film illegal forest felling. In August 2020, they kept in touch through mobile phones when they set up a blockade across a section of the BR-163, the key highway that carries soya beans through the forest, of the port of Santarém on the Amazon River. Wearing headdresses and painted faces, they demanded improvements in healthcare, the removal of illegal miners from their territories, and most of all, to be consulted about plans to build a railway next to their land. Another indigenous group that is harnessing technology to defend their culture and land are the Juma. Following a series of massacres carried out by rubber tappers and gold tappers, together with the toll of deadly diseases, the number of Juma, estimated to have been 15,000 in the 18th century, had dwindled by the mid-1900s to just 6 people, made up of a single family, 3 sisters named Borea, Mande, Ameta, and their father, Eruka, their father's sister, and her husband. To help them survive, they were taken in 1998 from their original territory beside the Ashua River in the south of Amazonas state to the territory of the Urau-Wawau beside the Jamari River in the distant state of Rondônia. Although they spoke the same language, they were a completely different ethnic group and they felt marginalized. A few months after arrival, Eruka's sister and her husband died. apparently from the impact of exile and their inability to adapt well to a new region. In 2013, the others decided to return to their own territory. In 2021, Aruka died from COVID, and it seemed that the survivors were destined to disappear, as has occurred to so many indigenous peoples in the Amazon. But this has not happened. Even though traditionally the Juma have been organised on patriarchal lines, the sisters took over. Before their father died, they had married Uru'u Wawau men and brought them back to their territory on their return. Today, many of the children identify themselves as both Juma and Uru'u Wawau. Their village is bustling, centred around their maloka, the communal longhouse, built in the traditional Juma way with a saw-in roof. Their top priority today is to protect their territory, a hot spot of land grabbing and illegal deforestation. Mande, who spent much of her childhood in the Uru'u Wawau village, was horrified when confronted with what happened to the Juma's territory. Once located in the middle of a thick forest, their land is now surrounded by pasture illegally planted by non-indigenous invaders. The Juma Indigenous Territory covers 38,351 hectares, an area larger than Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and the Juma are using digital technology to combat invaders. As well as patrolling the territory by boat, they are using drones, donated by the Indigenous not-for-profit organisation, which trains Indigenous peoples in surveillance techniques. Back in the village, the Indigenous are connected to the internet by a dish antenna and are in constant contact with the outside world, sending and receiving WhatsApp messages on their phones. This makes it far easier for them to alert the world when their land is being invaded. The Juma believe that it is essential to maintain their language, Kahawahi, which is severely endangered because so many of the people who used to speak it have been decimated by the contact with the outside world. It is estimated that today only 560 people are fluent in Kawahi. In 2019, the Juma invited a linguist, Wesley dos Santos, to visit, and he helped them develop a multimedia dictionary for their phone, along with assembling an online collection of digital archives with traditional narratives, monologues and songs in the Juma language. Despite all these advances, Mande is worried about their future. There are only 24 inhabitants in their village, and she fears that there are not enough Juma men to increase their population. She is also grappling with the challenge of passing down Juma's traditions to the next generation. It was the evening of August 27, 2023, when young Munduruku women and warriors began painting their bodies with jenipapo, an Amazonian fruit used by various peoples in South America to decorate their bodies and make handicrafts. The following day, Brazil's Federal Supreme Court was to resume its judgment on the crucial time frame case, which seeks to limit new demarcations of indigenous lands, which would be a severe setback. The Supreme Court was known to be divided, and the Munduruku were eager to mobilize opposition to the change. The Munduruku were in the village of Nova Trairau on the upper Tabajos River. From different communities located in different creeks, they had taken part in the georeferencing courses or audiovisual workshops and political meetings over the previous days. The village is home to the Wakuboran Association, a group led by women whose focus is the fight against threats to the territory and the lives of indigenous peoples. There was hardly any parawat, the Munduruku word for non-indigenous people, present to witness the indigenous demonstration. The ritual that took place on the morning of August 28th called for spiritual protection against the evils that threaten the forest and its peoples. But it was also, and above all, a kind of performance for the cameras, operated by young people from the Wakoborun Audiovisual Collective. The dances, the war cries, the placards and the speeches, all focusing on opposition to the time frame, were recorded in several different videos and were quickly shared on Instagram and Twitter. Dressed in traditional clothes, painted and wielding weapons as if they were going to war, the Munduruku used new media and technologies to reaffirm their identity and fight for their rights. They also know how to use symbols to their advantage. In front of the Resistance Training Centre, a place where the Munduruku meet in assemblies and plan political actions, such as marking out the limits of their territories themselves, a traditional form of resistance, a young man films the demonstration with a mobile phone. In this single image, he shows that the indigenous know how to bring together tradition and technology, the new and the old, children and adults, to build resistance day after day, incorporating new elements without ever abandoning their own traditions and customs. In the end, the court voted against the time frame, as the indigenous people demanded, for their ruling only to be overruled later by the Brazilian Congress. The struggle goes on, and the Munduruku will use all technological weapons at their disposal in their heroic struggle for their land, language, and culture. Bernardino, a jovial Tushuao from the Satare Mawa indigenous people, had led a retomada, an occupation of ancestral land. Bernardino belongs to the group of Satare who live in the Andiramao Indigenous Reserve, located in the remote area of the states of Amazonas and Para. When the reserve was demarcated back in 1986, a large area further south besides the Mariacua River was not included. This area was inhabited for hundreds of years by a large group of Satare Mao, but most left after a major epidemic in the middle of the 20th century. To outsiders, the Indigenous Reserve, covering 7,885 square kilometres, may seem large area for the 13,350 Satare. But this is a mistaken perception, according to ecologist Ricardo Scholes, who said, "The idea that a few indigenous have more land than they need is a fallacy. The indigenous have an excellent record in maintaining the environmental quality of their land, but to achieve this they need vast areas so they can exploit their territory at a very low level of intensity. Indigenous areas in Brazil generally have a population density of less than 1 inhabitant per square kilometre." Bernardino had told us that a few months before our visit, a white man introducing himself as the owner of the land came to his home, offering compensation if everyone would leave. The outsider resorted to an old trick commonly used during the colonial period. First he offered a bottle of cachaca, sugarcane rum, and then placed a wad of cash on the table. Bernardino turned down the offer, and after that the threats began. According to Sergio Butel, an employee of the indigenous agency FUNAI in the Paratins, an unnamed man from the south of Brazil came to his government office and asked them to evict the indigenous besides the Mariacua River, producing a map that proved, the man said, that he was the real owner. And Sergio Butel said this: "It took us by surprise. We told him that the Satare had long ago asked for this area to be included in their territory and that the FUNAI office in Brasilia was dealing with their demand. We consulted official records to see if the outsider had any basis for his claims. We couldn't locate the relevant land titles in the local real estate office, but were able to access registration data within CAR. That's Brazil's official land registry. There we found his claim asserting ownership to a large area, including Bernardino's village. CAR is a digital cadastre in which owners, or those claiming ownership, can state how much land they own. There is no independent verification of their claim. It has become an effective tool in the hands of land thieves, and even the authorities admit. Ioni Nakamura, head of agrarian legal prosecution for Parastate, points to a serious shortcoming by saying, "Car is an instrument by which the landowners themselves make their declarations, and often their claims are superimposed on land effectively and historically occupied by traditional populations who, because they don't have access to the necessary technology and technological assistance, don't produce information for the state's official land recording systems." Land registered as void and claimed by the thieves is located time and again in areas prioritised for agribusiness expansion and investment. The predicament faced by the Saturé at Campo Branco is no isolated case. Nearly 500 indigenous groups are asking FUNAI to withdraw the boundaries of their territories to include ancestral land, and more demands are expected in the future. Land registration has been chaotic in the Brazilian Amazon for many decades, with so many false claims made that in the 1970s people joked about the properties owners claiming different stories for the same piece of land. The Amazon urgently needs an efficient and accurate land registration system, and for many the georeference process made possible by CAR seems to be the solution, and the World Bank has provided $45.5 million to help fund it. But it is a system heavily weighted against traditional communities. Georeferencing originates with a digital image, an aerial photo for example, then adds geographic information to the image so that GIS or mapping software can place the image in a real-world location. But when this digital process is used exclusively and not combined with on-the-ground surveying, it is extremely vulnerable to fraud. This is so obvious that CAR can only have been adopted with a purpose of benefiting land thieves. Similar schemes are also being adopted in many other South American countries. GRAIN, an international NGO that works with peasant communities throughout the world, says that hundreds of thousands of peasant families, fisherfolk and forest communities typically inhabiting rural forest, savanna and wetland areas are being erased from official records. In what GRAIN calls a digital land grab, they are becoming invaders of their own property. It is this that is happening to Bernardino. Land grabbers have also become skillful in using social media. In areas of conflict, they have organised closed WhatsApp groups in which they can rapidly organise effective actions. One case is the so-called Dia do Fogo, Day of the Fire, carried out on August the 10th, 2019, and described by the BBC as a key moment in the recent history of Amazonia. A few days before it happened, a right-wing newspaper called Folha do Progresso, whose headquarters are in the hot and dusty town of Progresso, a stronghold of the land thieves, located beside the BR-163 highway that runs from Brasilia to Santarém on the Amazon River, ran extracts from the interview it had held with one of the land thieves. Today, young Saturé are using mobile phones to film and communicate when there's a connection. But they don't use social media, WhatsApp, etc. to mobilize resistance. Yet. Until recently, traditional people have employed new technology in a defensive way, to collect evidence, to force the authorities to help them defend land they already occupy. But an alliance of archaeologists, environmentalists, scientists from various disciplines and forest people is beginning to use cutting-edge technology to build a strong case for not just allowing traditional communities to stay on their lands, but for extending their occupation in the Amazon forest. If it succeeds, the alliance may allow the traditional communities to seize the initiative and take their fight to another level. The main technology used is LiDAR, that's light detection and ranging, which has become one of archaeology's most exciting modern technological tools. The roots of LiDAR technology can be traced back to the 20th century when Albert Einstein first introduced the concept of stimulated emission. That is, the emission of photons by stimulating electrons when photons collide with them, which became the foundation for laser technology. It was the military who were the first to develop it as a practical tool, yet another example of the key role that the arms race plays in developing new technology. During the Cold War, the United States military used it for reconnaissance and terrain mapping purposes. It was deployed on aircraft to create detailed topographic maps, which were invaluable for strategic planning and intelligence gathering. Soon, it was also being used in industries such as forestry, agriculture, and urban planning, as it allowed for accurate and up-to-date information on land use and natural resources. Today, the automobile industry is employing it to develop driverless cars, for LiDAR sensors perceive the surrounding, detect obstacles, measure distances, and thus ensure safety in road traffic. To sum up, LiDAR technology is a testament to the ability of a single technology to transform multiple industries. In recent years, it has become clear that LiDAR technology is also an important new tool for archaeologists. It allows planes flying over the forest to fire hundreds of thousands of rays per second, whilst most bounce back from the canopy. Others penetrate the ground underneath. It provides highly detailed and accurate models of the land surface, allowing the detection of hitherto unknown earthworks, bridges, and other structures buried by thick forest. Its first use in archaeology was in the early 2010s in Mexico when, to the amazement of archaeologists, it revealed a lost Maya city hidden below the forest canopy. Soon after, Mexican planes equipped with LiDAR flew over what was believed to be a minor indigenous site, but which LiDAR showed to have been much bigger. An anthropologist said that by flying over the forest for 45 minutes, the LiDAR team had accomplished what a conventional archaeological survey would achieve in a decade. It was first used in the Amazon in 2019 in a German-Bolivian expedition in the Bolivian Amazon. The archaeologists uncovered a lost city located in the heart of Llanos de Mojos in the Beni department of northern Bolivia. Covered in thick forest, the city had remained unnoticed for many years. The archaeologists discovered structures that had been placed on the ground with great care to form a design that possibly reflects the cosmology of the Casarabe, the dominant indigenous people at the time, who controlled a huge area of 1,700 square miles, from about 500 AD to 1400 AD. More recently, LiDAR has been used in an ambitious project in the Brazilian Amazon involving 160 researchers from many different disciplines. LiDAR is an expensive tool, and the scientists, without the deep pockets of the military, were able to map just 0.08% of the forest, spanning 2.6 million square miles. In this relatively small area, they discovered 24 unknown earthworks consisting of ditches, paths, and wells. Using existing data from other known earthworks, they were able to calculate with 90% of probability that there were more than 10,000 and possibly 23,000 earthworks lurking beneath the forest canopy. Around the settlements, the scientists identified domesticated plants such as Brazil nuts, pupunya, and ache, still staple foods in the region. The results were published in an article in the journal Science in October 2023. It means that at least 10 million people were probably living in the Amazon basin before the Europeans arrived. Disease and genocide later wiped out most of them, and the rainforest hid the evidence of the extensive population. Jonas de Sousa, from the University of Exeter, UK, said, "Most of the Amazon is still unexplored archaeologically. The more we survey, the more we realise that different parts of the basin were more settled than we thought. We have changed our idea about the Amazon." It has also given the indigenous a powerful political tool with which to demand action from the authorities. It exposes the absurdity of the so-called marco-temporal, or time limit, by which indigenous peoples will only be allowed to register their territory. Land that they were physically occupying on October the 5th, 1988, the year when the current constitution was promulgated. Vinicius Peripato, the geographer who coordinated the writing of the Science article, put it like this: "In this horrific discussion about the marco-temporal, the work has an important political value, for it shows that the indigenous presence in the region goes back for a very long while, creating landscapes and modifying nature. And this means that it makes no sense at all to establish the arbitrary date of 1988 to define indigenous presence." Peripato explained that the only reason the indigenous were not occupying much more land on October 5th, 1988, was because they had been expelled. Moreover, the study makes a profound contribution to the global debate on how to confront the escalating climate crisis while feeding the world's population. By showing that far more people were living in the Amazon basin when the Europeans arrived, earlier than believed, it corroborates the account written by the Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, who chronicled the voyage of Francisco de Orellana down to the Amazon River from Peru to the estuary in the 1540s. He reported large cities, well-maintained roads, and big buildings on the banks of the river. His account was lodged in the Archivo de Indias and largely forgotten for over 300 years. Even after the archive was re-examined, some like the American archaeologist Betty Meggers, who died in 2012, didn't believe that the Amazon soils, poor in nutrients and acidic, could have possibly supported productive agriculture and large populations. For many, it was a reasonable assumption, for until recently some scientists found it hard to imagine that illiterate indigenous populations could possess a more profound knowledge of forest management than modern agronomists. But for decades, archaeologists have challenged this claim, and the Science article comes down decisively on their side. Scientists will now have to work out how the indigenous were able to feed such a large population without harming the forest. Some progress has already been made. Anthropologists and archaeologists know that the indigenous peoples developed great skill in the domestication of plants. They enhanced food production by selectively breeding trees and plants, that is, by choosing individuals that had the desired characteristics for maximizing food production and making sure their seeds were propagated. The indigenous had a powerful incentive for managing the forest without damaging it, for along with food they depended on it for medicines, materials for building their huts, and countless other necessities. The Science article has confirmed what a new generation of Brazilian archaeologists, such as Eduardo Neves, has long been saying, with Neves saying this: We now know that the Amazon was one of the main cradles of plant cultivation in the world. There is no longer any doubt about that. Numerous very important plants were first cultivated in the Amazon, including manioc, cacao, papaya, peanuts, and tobacco. It is a long list, and we now have the archaeological evidence to prove it. The Amazon was a centre for agrobiological diversity. The domestication of plants is continuing in the Amazon. Along with the indigenous, other traditional peoples like the Beira de Rios and the Ribeiro de Os, both terms for people living on the banks of the river, have been quietly doing the same thing, using knowledge that was handed down through the generations from their indigenous and peasant ancestors. A good example of this is how the community has lived in the upper reaches of the Tapajós River for almost 2 centuries. Like most people in the Amazon, they rely on manioc for their carbohydrates. The astonishing thing is that the community has created a veritable germplasm bank in the small stretches of land they cultivate. And they have developed more than 30 varieties, the vast majority of which have been catalogued by agronomists. This is a remarkable feat. When you realise that the cassava is reproduced through clonal propagation, that is, it produces genetically identical plants through asexual propagation. That is, the farmers plant a stem and what sprouts has the same genetic information as the mother plant. The Beiraderos only managed to develop new varieties through very careful management by which existing varieties are crossed, producing new varieties that may or may not have characteristics that are worth keeping and incorporated into their seed bank. Other techniques have also been used by the indigenous peoples to enhance food production, apart from the domestication of plants. One of the ways is using terra preta, a dark-coloured soil very unusual for the Amazon, which is rich in nutrients, organic material, minerals, and beneficial for microorganisms. Its fertility is due to the presence of large amounts of charcoal, which gives the soil its dark colour and provides several beneficial characteristics. There is no doubt that terra preta was invented by indigenous people because it contains large amounts of charcoal, bone, human remains, human waste, stone tools, and pottery shards. While the earthworks uncovered by the scientists are generally located in areas with high temperatures and relatively low rainfall, terra preta is largely found in wetter areas. This suggests that a sizable populations were also once living in regions where there are today no remains of earthworks. Overall, the indigenous, multifaceted approach to forest management, in which the guiding principle is to work with the forest, not against it, makes a huge contrast with modern industrial farming, which destroys the original vegetation before planting monocultures. The so-called modern farmers believe that the Amazon must be conquered, colonized and transformed. It is the opposite of the indigenous view, which sees humans and nature as fully intertwined and impossible to untangle. Food production can only be increased in harmony with the forest, not in conflict, they believe. Neves sees this as the essential factor that lies behind the forest's remarkable biodiversity, for so long seen as the product of natural evolution. And he says, the Amazon rainforest is not so much or not only a natural heritage, but also a biocultural heritage. The Amazon Revealed LiDAR project is being carried out in close collaboration with forest peoples. Local researchers are being trained to record and display the region's broad spectrum of domesticated species, not only those developed in the distant past, but also the ones created in recent years. The idea is to show how forest peoples are continually transforming the forest, making it more useful to human populations. This approach also ensures that scientists tap into the profound knowledge that the indigenous peoples have of the forest. They can tell them where the greatest clusters of domesticated plants and the richest patches of terra preta are to be found, as well as help them to discover other indigenous farming techniques. But the scientists are also anxious to act as a counterweight to the view, prevalent on the television and social media, that are increasingly finding their way into indigenous villages, that the forest is a hostile, dangerous environment. They want to ensure that the new generation of indigenous know how this view was deliberately fashioned and how best to combat it. For years, the idea that the forest was an enemy to be vanquished was promoted, said archaeologist Bruna Rocha to a class of young residents in the community of Manalito on the banks of the Iriri River, one of the tributaries of the vast Xingu River, itself a tributary of the mighty Amazon. The idea put around was that there was nothing positive about the forest, except the wealth that could be extracted from it, like iron ore and gold, says Bruna Rocha. And she explains that this idea, which dates to the colonial era, was promoted by the military dictatorship between 1964 to 1985 to justify large mining projects and huge ranches funded by tax breaks. And Bruna says, the ruralist group, that's a group of extreme right-wing landowners in Congress, still defends this view in their fight against forest peoples, who they see as an obstacle to their economic interests. The young residents are all taking part in a course sponsored by the NGO ISA and the Darwin Initiative. That's a UK government scheme for biodiversity, conservation and poverty reduction, which is playing a key role in the struggle of indigenous and traditional peoples to stay on their land. Manalito is a peaceful place with just a few families, most of whom practice subsistence agriculture and collect products from the forest. The centuries-old trees growing beside some of the houses is evidence of the Amazon's long history of human occupation, going back to before the arrival of the Portuguese, and the very way of life for the families shows that communities can live in harmony with the forest without destroying it. But the Iriri River communities have not escaped the onslaught of the encroaching world. Manalito is one of the many communities in the region known as Terra do Meio that lies between the Xingu and the Tapajós rivers. Like so many other non-indigenous communities brought to the Amazon to extract products to send abroad, these communities date back to the early days of rubber exploitation in the mid-19th century, when some of their ancestors settled on the banks of the tributaries of the rivers in the Xingu Basin. It was a harsh life, made worse by the debt peonage imposed by the rubber barons. When the rubber boom spectacularly collapsed in 1912, the tappers survived by developing subsistence agriculture and supplying skins and furs to Europe and North America. After it became fashionable to wear coats, hats and other accessories made from the pelts of wild animals. A mass industry sprung up almost overnight, and the hides of otters, jaguars and alligator-like caimans were soon being shipped round the world. When that boom busted, the families had to deal with the rush into the region of wildcat gold miners, the mercury contamination that stemmed from the mining, and sundry other problems. The 1990s also saw the rise of land grabbing, when land thieves began seizing huge swathes of traditionally occupied land. Throughout it all, the Beiraderos resisted and, aided by the international furore following the murder in 2005 by land grabbers of the American nun Dorothy Stang, they managed to create a mosaic of conservation units. Today, this mosaic, covering more than 8 million hectares, is one of the largest preserved areas of rainforest in eastern Amazonia. Today, the mosaic is being invaded, but its creation earned the traditional populations a breathing space, and they now hope that, with the aid of outside supporters and digital technology, they are better equipped to deal with invasions. It is an exciting time to be involved in Amazonian research, with the old certainties being challenged. But the significance of the LiDAR discoveries goes far beyond a revolution in academic thinking. The global climate crisis is entering a new phase, with the sudden acceleration of environmental crises all over the world. In many Earth systems, we are seeing the kind of instability. System theorists call it flickering. That suggests that they are approaching a tipping point. The loss of sea ice on both the Arctic and Antarctic now seems irreversible, with catastrophic consequences for rises in global sea levels and extreme weather events. July 2023 was recorded as the hottest month ever recorded in the world, only to be surpassed in July 2024 at 0.03 degrees centigrade warmer recorded by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, otherwise known as NOAA. In less than 50 years, a third of the world's population could be living in places as hot as the hottest parts of the Sahara today. New research in the Amazon has found what scientists call precursor signals of an approaching critical transition. A combination of deforestation and climate breakdown could cut off the circulation of rainfall in the basin, triggering a rapid flip from rainforest to savanna. The implications of this study are huge. Where it leads, only time will tell. As the world hurtles towards the sixth mass extinction, billions will probably be unable to survive, even if drastic action is taken now, which seems unlikely. One of the few ways forward is to learn from ancient indigenous knowledge and begin to live in harmony with nature, working with it to improve biodiversity and increase food production. If the Amazon forest, or at least some of it, is to be saved, this approach would have to be adopted on a massive scale, which is a huge challenge. The first step is to reverse the current felling and start allowing the forest to recover. By strengthening the indigenous case for reclaiming vast tracts of the forest, archaeologists using new digital techniques like LiDAR are allies in this struggle. Brunner is aware of this, saying, "It is a political struggle, and we must ask, how can new archaeological techniques contribute to this fight?" Reflecting on this chapter has led me to consider how technology of any kind becomes a battleground of ideas, and one writer that comes to mind is the Canadian theorist Harold Innis, who wrote Empire and Communications, published in 1950. Innis was the first to study how communications created civilizations and empires, and that, to use Marx's terminology, those who controlled the means of communication were the creators of the monopoly of knowledge and how systems were governed. The ancient Egyptians and the Catholic Church are examples of how such systems of thought worked, with highly trained scribes creating text on papyrus and paper that was the basis of living. Throughout history, people without the specialisms to write, who did not have access to those modes of communication and of which were illiterate, were governed by monopolies of knowledge. The much underappreciated Harold Innis passed away in 1952, and the rise of social media and the internet would have challenged his thesis on empire, communications and power, because of the decentralization that the internet offers, with competing forms of knowledge to what Marx had called the dominant ideology. The Kayapo, Juma and Munduruku have become technologically literate, with the Saturé catching up, and they now offer alternative modes of thinking to those who have had a monopoly of knowledge by using the technology and internet as a form of resistance and dissent against the narratives land thieves create on social media. Digital technology has become the latest weapon to be used on all sides in the long history of land struggle in the Amazon. It has been effectively used by land thieves, as exemplified in both their use of the digital cadastre car to steal land from traditional communities and the illegal land fires organised through their WhatsApp groups. But, as I have seen on my travels in Amazonia, Indigenous peoples are becoming ever more skillful in their use of digital technology. As the story of the Kayabo illustrates, they have developed throughout their history a phenomenal ability to incorporate and appropriate goods from outside, particularly when they can be used as weapons of cultural and territorial self-defense. Today, they are monitoring their territories through their smartphones, using drones to catch land invaders in the act and using digital archives to record and celebrate their rich cultural history. Added to this, in recent years scientists have been helping forest people to create new weapons of resistance by using innovative technological developments like LiDAR. Moreover, traditional peoples, particularly Indigenous, show us how to live. Nobody knows if humankind will survive the 6th mass extinction, but to many Indigenous peoples, this seems almost irrelevant. They say they have no choice but to struggle, even against the odds, and they do so while remaining happy, which is their baseline mood. They may be dispirited and angered by the staggering damage being done to their forest by outsiders, but paradoxically, they continue to enjoy life, laughing and frolicking in their villages. They have a capacity for joy that much of the outside world has lost, who have record levels of depression and alienation. Perhaps this is more than anything else, is their great gift to humankind. So, who am I in this story of resistance? I am Sue Branford, and I have worked in the Brazilian Amazon for a long time. Indigenous peoples in Brazil have always been quick to use whatever tools they can to defend their territory and their culture in open defiance of the values espoused by the encroaching dominant ideology. The Indigenous are using their phones to organise surveillance groups, to film illegal land invasions and to employ drones. They are setting up their own WhatsApp groups to tell the world what is happening. The centuries-long story of ideological people's dissent from the dominant ideology has been vastly underreported. It is only now, as mankind totters on the edge of catastrophic climate change, that the ideas defended by the Indigenous peoples of a radically different way of treating nature, not as an enemy, but as an ally, is finally gaining resonance. This is the story I want to tell. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.